The rings screamed first, and the alarms came a half-second later, as if even the station's own sirens needed a moment to believe what they were hearing. Wren Kessler dropped the data canister cart and grabbed the observation rail as Vantage Station shuddered around her. Through the meter-thick viewport below, the cradle's outer bands, 3 concentric rings of black Caledon alloy, each wider than a starship hull, had stopped their slow, 5,000-year drift and locked, hard, into a configuration nobody on the platform had a name for. Threndal technicians scrambled across the gallery behind her, mandibles clacking in short, panicked bursts that her translator collar rendered as fragments. Bleed the array, bleed it now. Someone bleed the array. Below, in the pit where the 5th millennial assay had been running for 6 hours in front of every camera, an infodrone the assembly owned, the Cascade Array's collection dish glowed the color of a dying coal. It was the most power anyone had ever pointed at the cradle in 5,000 years of trying, and Wren watched it fail in real time, watched the golden lattice lines that crawled across the vaults in her face flare white, seize, and then start to count asterisk. Wren had never been this close to Archscientist Ilyu Van Tren before, only a gray shape at ceremony podiums, always at a careful distance. Now she watched the Archscientist stride out onto the pit floor itself, against every safety line painted on the deck, all 4 limbs braced wide against the shuddering platform, mandibles snapping out orders to cut the array's feed before the resonance could double back into the rings a second time. The order came too late to matter. The dish kept bleeding power into the lattice for 6 more seconds after Van Tren gave it, an equipment lag some junior technician would spend the rest of the week being blamed for, and by the time the feed actually died, whatever had started counting was already counting for good. She didn't know yet that it was a countdown. Nobody did, not for another 11 minutes, but she felt it in her sternum, the way you feel a door slam somewhere else in a house, wrong, sudden, final. Move, a Threndal supervisor barked at her, not unkindly, just fast, herding the human cleaning staff back toward the lift shaft. Wren went, because she was 15 and a runner and runners did what supervisors said. But she kept her eyes on the pit as long as the closing blast doors let her, and what she saw in that last sliver of light was the lattice pattern freezing mid-motion into a shape unlike anything she'd cataloged in 8 months of shelving failed assay footage. It didn't look broken. It looked like something had been interrupted mid-sentence. She'd been hired onto the assay's ceremonial detail 2 months ago for exactly this kind of day. The 5th millennial had been planned for a full standard year, timed to the precise anniversary of Threll Koss's original sealing, and every human contract dependent on the station's junior labor roster had been rotated through some part of the setup. Cable runs, seating for the viewing gallery, canister sorting for the archive team that would need to catalog whatever the Cascade Array recorded. Nobody had expected the array to record a failure loud enough to lock the rings. By the time the doors sealed behind her, a voice she recognized as Counselor Bracca's, thin, overmodulated even through the translator, the voice of someone used to being agreed with, was already looping on the public feed screens lining the lift shaft. The assembly regrets to confirm that the 5th millennial assay has concluded without success. Preliminary telemetry indicates the cradle's structural array has entered an unprecedented active state. A full account will follow within the hour. The council asks for patience and calm. Nobody in the packed lift looked calm. Wren caught the eye of an older Threndal archivist she recognized from the sublevel, whose antennae had gone flat and low, and even without fluent body language she understood the shape of what she was seeing. 5,000 years was long enough that failure had become a kind of weather. This was something else. By the time the doors sealed, the Cradle of Ossanu had defeated the Threndal Science Assembly for exactly 5,000 years, to the day, and though nobody would know this for 6 more days, had just started a clock that would either open or close forever. The lift doors didn't open again for 11 minutes, long enough for the packed car to run through every kind of silence a dozen frightened people could produce, the muttering kind, the praying kind, the kind that came from simply running out of words to offer each other. Wren spent it doing the only thing that kept her hands from shaking: counting. She counted the rivets in the ceiling panel, then the seconds between the station's automated pressure check chimes. Then, when even that ran out, the number of times the Threndal archivist beside her flexed and unflexed her mandibles. A nervous tick Wren was only just starting to learn to read. When the doors finally opened onto the understrata concourse, the public feed screens had already updated with the number that would define the next 6 days of her life. Countdown to structural lock: 143, 58, 12, and falling. A junior assembly clerk in blue was arguing with a maintenance supervisor about whether the number was even real or just an artifact of the same lattice glitch that had frozen the rings in the first place. And around the two of them, a river of human and Threndal contract labor kept moving anyway, because shifts didn't stop for a species-wide emergency. Not on Vantage Station. Not when every hour of downtime came directly out of somebody's contract renewal file. Wren stood still in the current of it for a long moment, the only person on the whole concourse not moving toward anywhere in particular, and watched the number fall by 4 seconds while she watched it. Her shift supervisor found her there, a broad, unhurried woman named Priya Akonkores who ran the ceremonial detail roster, and had exactly the amount of patience it took to manage 40 teenage contract workers inside a Threndal institution that had never quite decided whether human children were labor or liability. Priya steered her toward the locker bay by one shoulder, without a word of scolding, which was somehow worse than if she'd yelled. "Go home, Kessler," she said, once the noise of the concourse had thinned behind them. "Whatever that was down there, it wasn't a training incident, and it isn't going to become one on my roster. Go find your dad. Get off the concourse before the rumor mill decides you were standing closer to it than you were." It was the first small kindness of a week that would end up asking a great deal of Wren, and she was too rattled to properly thank her for it. Something she would remember, weeks later, and go back and do properly, once there was enough context to explain why it had mattered. Vantage Station itself did what it always did in the hours after something went wrong. It kept functioning, loudly and with great bureaucratic care, as though function were a kind of denial. Ceremonial detail contracts, Wren's included, were suspended for the ring but not canceled, which meant a week of half pay and full anxiety for every human family whose bonded labor depended on it. The public feed looped Counselor Braca's common patience message on a 20-minute cycle, and somewhere around the 4th repetition, Wren stopped hearing the words at all and just watched the number underneath it keep falling, hour by hour, the only honest thing on the whole screen. She learned, second-hand and in fragments over the following 2 hours, what the rest of the station already half knew: that the Cradle of Ossanu was not merely old but foundational, the reason the Threndal Science Assembly existed in its current form at all. Threlkas hadn't found it by accident. The earliest surviving assembly text described a targeted expedition, chasing a rumor that something in this system had been built to last, and what they'd found, drifting in a debris field that had once been a moon, was a structure the size of a small city, 3 concentric rings of black alloy wrapped around a sealed core, radiating an age that predated every spacefaring species the Threndal had yet catalogued. They had named it a cradle because nothing else fit, not a weapon, not a tomb, not a message, just an object built with a patience no living culture had ever met. Vantage Station itself had been raised in its shadow 400 years later, an entire orbital settlement built for the sole purpose of one day answering the question the cradle refused to answer. Wren thought about that, standing in the locker bay with her vest still zipped to her throat, and felt something that wasn't quite awe and wasn't quite fear settle into the space where her earlier panic had been. She was 15 years old, on a station built around a mystery older than every written language on Earth, and she had just watched it start counting down to the last chance anyone would ever get to answer it. It would take her most of the rest of the day, and one long, unbroken look at a notebook full of doodled stars, before that stopped feeling like someone else's problem. Her father found her 20 minutes later in the understrata mess, still in her work vest, staring at nothing. Dale Kessler was station maintenance, contract bonded like every human on Vantage, and he had the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the afternoon rerouting coolant lines 3 different Threndal engineers insisted were not his to touch, and who had then been told by 4 separate people that his daughter had been standing too close to something important when it broke. They're saying the whole vault's on some kind of timer now. He dropped into the seat across from her, rubbing grease off his knuckles with a rag that had given up being white a year ago. 6 days. Then it locks up tight and nobody gets another crack at it. Not that anybody's gotten a crack at it in 5,000 years anyway. I saw it happen. Wren pulled her knees up onto the bench, arms around them. The lattice, it didn't look like data corrupting. It looked like somebody hit pause. You saw it from a cart in the observation gallery, kiddo, not from inside the pit. He said it gently, the way he said most things to her, but there was an edge under it, the same edge that had been there since her last review, when a Threndal floor manager had written * excessive curiosity, redirect to assigned duties on a form neither of them were supposed to read. Contracts got reviewed every cycle. Curiosity did not appear anywhere on the list of qualities Vantage Station, paid to import from Earth. I'm not making it up. I didn't say you were. He reached over and squeezed her wrist once before standing. Just, it's not our problem to solve, Wren. It's theirs. It's been theirs for 5,000 years. Eat something. Call your mother tonight. She's got a window at 1900 before the convoy jumps. Her mother's face, when the comm finally connected that evening across a lag long enough to make every sentence feel considered twice, was tired in the specific way of someone 4 months into an 8-month terraform contract 3 systems away. Neither of Wren's parents was dead, or dying, or lost to some tragedy that had shaped her into anything. They were just far apart and doing the unglamorous math of keeping a family solvent across 2 solar systems, and Wren loved them both fiercely and separately, and did not, in fact, need either of them to explain who she was. You've got that look, her mother said, after the lag caught up and delivered Wren's hello. The one your dad calls the gear-grinding look. There's a 5,000-year-old vault down in the science ring, and it just started a countdown, and I think everybody who's ever tried to open it has been asking the wrong question. Wren said it in one breath, and watched her mother's mouth twitch, not quite a smile, not quite worry. Course you do. A pause, long enough to be the lag and not just consideration. Eat, sleep, and if you're going to chase something that isn't yours to chase, tell your father before you do it, not after. I love you. Tell Milo's drawing made me cry, would you? Next time he calls, he sent one of the 2 of you on the observation deck, and I don't know how a 10-year-old gets homesickness into a crayon, but he managed it. Milo had sent Wren the same drawing 2 days earlier, tucked into a data packet with a note in his careful, backward-leaning print. Drew it without lifting the crayon. Betcha can't tell where I started. She could tell, actually. There was always a seam, a place where even the most careful hand hesitated for half a heartbeat before committing to the next stroke. But she hadn't told him that, because some things a big sister let a little brother believe he'd gotten away with. Their grandmother, Dale's mother, a retired transit engineer who had never left Earth and never intended to, and who wrote actual paper letters on the theory that anything worth saying was worth saying slowly, had given Wren the notebook at the shuttle gate 3 years ago, the day the Kessler family split itself across 3 star systems for the first time. Wren remembered the gate more clearly than she remembered most of that year. The recycled plastic smell of the departure lounge, her mother already through security and waving from the far side of the glass, Milo 7 years old and refusing to let go of Dale's coat sleeve, and her grandmother crouching down, knees popping audibly. a sound that had embarrassed 12-year-old Wren at the time, and that she would have given almost anything to hear again since. To press the spiral-bound notebook into her hands like it was something breakable. "Paper remembers different than a screen," her grandmother had said. The same line Milo would repeat back to Wren, solemn and slightly garbled, 2 years later when he handed over the twin notebook as though passing a family heirloom rather than a 5-credit stationary item. "A screen remembers what you typed. Paper remembers what your hand was doing while you typed it, the pressure, the hesitation, the place you almost didn't finish a line. You're going somewhere that won't have much use for hesitation, sweetheart. Don't lose the habit of it anyway." Wren hadn't understood what she meant at 12. She understood it a great deal better at 15, sitting in a bunk on a station that had, in fact, spent 3 years quietly training the hesitation out of her. Threndal supervisors who wanted clean answers and no visible uncertainty, contract reviews that treated a raised hand or a pointed question as a species of insubordination, an entire institutional culture built by a people who, she now understood with the fresh, awful clarity of the last 2 days, quite literally, could not perceive a thought in the middle of changing its own mind. The star game had started even earlier than the notebook, at a kitchen table on Earth that Wren could still see clearly if she closed her eyes, her grandmother's kitchen, cluttered with the particular chaos of a woman who fixed transit switches for a living, and treated her own home with the same patient, unhurried competence. She taught 7-year-old Wren the 5-pointed star first, the way half the world's grandmothers probably had at some point, pencil never lifting, and Wren had gotten it wrong 9 times before her hand finally understood what her eyes already knew. And something about that, the specific, private triumph of a shape that only worked if you trusted it and refused to stop moving, had lodged itself somewhere she never entirely dug back out. She'd invented her own variations within a month. 6 points, 7, shapes with no name at all, spirals that had to double back on themselves without ever technically crossing, and by the time she turned 9, she'd filled 2 full notebooks with nothing else, much to her mother's fond bewilderment and her father's quiet pride, the specific pride of a parent watching a kid practice something with no obvious use, just because the practicing itself felt like it mattered. It had never once in 8 years felt like it might matter to anyone but her. That was the thing she sat with longest, that night in her bunk, notebook still unopened on her knees, the recycled station air humming faintly through a vent that needed servicing her father wasn't authorized to give it. A doodle her grandmother taught her before either of them had any reason to think it would matter. A drawing game her little brother took seriously enough to hand over his own copy like a torch passed. 8 months of tedious archive, sorting that any Threndal supervisor would have told her required no thought at all. She didn't know yet that all 3 of those things were about to collide into the center of a 5,000-year mystery. She only knew, opening the notebook at last to a blank page, that her hand wanted to draw the lattice pattern before her brain had finished deciding it was a good idea, and that the wanting itself felt like something she had been building toward her whole life without ever being told what it was for. She thought before she started drawing of messaging Milo, of telling her 10-year-old brother that the thing he'd handed her so solemnly at a shuttle gate 2 years ago had turned out, maybe, to matter more than either of them had guessed. She didn't send it. Not yet. Some things, she decided, a big sister kept to herself until she was sure enough to say them out loud without her voice shaking. The same careful instinct that made her not tell him about the seam in his crayon drawings, and she put the slate down and picked up the pencil instead. She flipped to a blank page and started drawing the lattice pattern from memory. Her hand knew before her brain did that something about it was wrong for a 5,000-year-old dead language. It never crossed itself. Not once in 8 months of archive footage. The Ossanu Vault Assembly's public catalog held 412 documented attempts to read the cradle's surface pattern, going back to the very first warden, Threndal Kessler, who had sealed the site with religious ceremony 5,000 years ago, after 3 of her own Assiers laid their hands flat against the vault's face and lost them, crushed between rotating bands that nobody had thought were still moving. Threll Koss wrote the null touch accord in her own blood analog that same week. No living hand would touch the cradle again, not while she or any warden after her had breath to forbid it. Every attempt since had been remote. Scanners, drones, light, sound, never skin. Wren had read Threll Koss's original account twice, on a terminal that still rendered the oldest assembly script in a jagged, hand-pressed font. We came to learn the founding warden had written, and left with 3 fewer hands among us and no answer at all. Let it be recorded that the cradle does not forgive an unprepared approach, and let no Assier after me forget it. 3,000 years later, Chief Cryptologist Yevumarn ran the pattern through the loom, the first true reasoning engine the Threndal had ever built, for 11 straight years, treating each frozen frame of the lattice as an isolated glyph cluster to be parsed like a sentence. No internal grammar detected, Marn's final report concluded. I recommend cessation. The loom's verdict became doctrine, the Marn null result, and nobody in 3,000 years since had seriously proposed picking the question back up. 800 years ago, Archscientist Pelina Juvet tried something stranger. She stopped treating the lattice as text and started treating it as music, mapping the width and pulse of each line to a harmonic register. The cradle hummed once, low and resonant, in response to one of her mapped sequences, and never hummed again, no matter what she tried. She died 3 decades later still adjusting the sequence by half tones, but Wren found, in the last box of her personal effects, a scrawled note never entered into the public record. It is not singing to me. It is trying to finish a sentence I keep interrupting. The cradle itself was less a vault than a wound the size of a stadium. 3 rings of Caledon alloy nested inside a shattered moon's leftover debris field, radiating a power source that had shown no measurable decay across 5,000 years of monitoring. Whatever the Caledon had been, the honest answer, after 5 millennia of study, was still asterisk nobody knew. They had built to outlast empires. A warden held ceremonial authority over the cradle site, a title passed from Threll Koss through 41 successors, charged with enforcing the null touch accord. Beneath the warden sat the Archscientist, a post Van Tren had inherited 9 seasons ago. Beneath her came the assay marshals like Draven, the tenured Assiers like Otrin Vel, and the junior adjutants like Sella. Wren, beneath all of it, wasn't part of the hierarchy at all. Human contract labor existed in a category the Assembly's own charter didn't formally recognize, which was, she would only understand much later, exactly the blind spot that let her see what 40 Archscientists never had. One entry was smaller and stranger than the rest, and had never made it into any formal report at all. A note, unsigned, filed loose in a maintenance log from roughly 600 years ago, describing a night shift technician who claimed the lattice had briefly synchronized with her own pulse while she stood near the outer ring on an unrelated repair job, and who had been quietly reassigned off cradle-adjacent duty within the week after raising it with her supervisor. The note had sat unsighted for 6 centuries until Wren, with nothing better to do on a slow shift, had pulled it purely because the filing tag looked wrong for its shelf. She copied it into the back of her notebook anyway, the same instinct that made her keep every stray thread that didn't fit the tidy version of a story. Wren knew all of this because she'd shelved the files herself, 1 canister at a time, sorting failed assays into a catalog nobody read, except the handful of archivists who'd stopped expecting a 5,013th attempt to look any different from the first. Her supervisor in the archive, a mid-tier Assier named Otrin Vel, who had never once used her name when runner would do, had told her on her 2nd week that the sorting work required no judgment at all, only patience, and that she should be grateful the Assembly trusted humans with even that much. What she hadn't done, until tonight, was lay 4 of the frozen frames side by side. She used the terminal in the understrata common room after curfew, when the human contract families were mostly asleep, and the Threndal night shift didn't bother patrolling levels that held nothing they valued. She pulled the raw scan data from Ajuvet's era, from Marn's, from 2 attempts in between, cropped each to the same relative section of the vault's face, and overlaid them. They didn't match. Of course they didn't. That was the whole 412 attempt argument for why the pattern was noise, or code, or nothing at all. It never repeated. But when she nudged the images against each other, rotating one against the timestamp recorded position of the rings at the moment each scan was taken, something in her chest went very still. The lines didn't just not repeat. They continued. Ajuvet's frame picked up, almost exactly, where a fragment from 3 centuries earlier left off, if you accounted for how far the rings had physically turned in the time between. 412 separate attempts, made by scientists who never once compared notes across a gap of centuries, had each captured a freeze frame of a single motion in progress, and every one of them had assumed they were looking at 412 different disconnected texts. She checked it twice more before she let herself believe it, cropping a third, unrelated frame from a minor assay 2 centuries after Marn's cessation order, one so obscure it hadn't even earned a named scientist in the catalog, just a serial number. It slotted into the sequence exactly where the ring math said it should. Nobody had ever asked whether it was one line. One long, unbroken, 5,000-year-old line, still being drawn, and every assay in history had only ever managed to take its photograph. She sat with that for a long time before she let herself get excited, because excitement was a thing that got you sent home on the next transport if you said it too loudly to the wrong person, and because she had been burned once already this cycle for excessive curiosity. But her pencil was moving before she'd finished the thought, tracing the composite shape onto a blank page of the notebook, and halfway through she understood, with the particular clean certainty of a thing that had been true the whole time and was only now visible, that the shape wanted to close. It wanted to come back to where it started without ever once crossing its own path. It was the star game, the one from the notebook, scaled up until it swallowed a 5,000-year-old vault. She didn't sleep that night, and in the morning she made the first mistake of the week and told the wrong person before the right one. Threndal listened to her for exactly as long as it took to realize what she was describing, and then laughed, not cruelly, which somehow made it worse, just the easy, dismissive laugh of someone who had spent his whole career believing certain conclusions were beneath re-examining. A runner has found what the loom could not, using a children's drawing game, he said, to the 2 other assiers at the sorting station, not to her. I have heard many things in this archive. That is a new one. He told her, not unkindly, to finish her canister sort before the shift ended, and to leave the science to people who had trained for it. Wren finished the sort. She did not stop believing what she'd seen. She found Cell instead, 2 levels down, in the archive sub-basement, where the junior adjutants ran their own overflow research between assignments. They weren't yet senior enough to be trusted with a loan. Cell was the youngest adjutant in the Assembly's junior tier, 3 seasons out of her scholar mold, and one of exactly 2 Threndal on the station who had ever spoken to Wren, as though she were a person conducting an investigation, rather than a human runner underfoot. Cell's chitin still carried the faint blue sheen of recent maturity, unweathered by the long gray seasons that marked the senior researchers, and she had a habit, scandalous, by Assembly standards, of asking questions in briefings that her superiors considered settled. She also, Wren had learned over the past 2 months of quiet archive conversations, had a cousin nymph barely past hatching whose carapace had begun showing the first gray mottling of the wilt, a fact Sella mentioned exactly once, flatly, and never again. Wren cornered her with the notebook open, and her voice too fast. It's not 412 failed attempts. It's one line. One continuous line, and everybody who ever scanned it only caught a piece, because you all photograph it and I don't think it's meant to be photographed. I think it's meant to be asterisk followed. Sella's antennae stilled the Threndal equivalent Wren had learned of a held breath. She took the notebook with 2 of her 4 hands, careful of the paper, and studied the overlay sketch for a long moment, her mandibles working through a soft click pattern the collar didn't bother translating because it wasn't speech, just the sound of a mind changing gears. You are proposing the founding assumption of every assay since Threll Koss was wrong, Sella said finally, in the careful cadence of someone testing how much trouble a sentence might cause her. That the cradle is not a message to decode, that it is a gesture, in progress. Yes. Wren, nothing on the station moves that way. Nothing in Threndal hands does either. Sella lifted one claw-tipped forelimb and flexed it, joint by joint, in 3 distinct, discrete increments, the way every Threndal hand moved, the way every stylus and stamp and etching tool on the station was built to move, because Threndal manipulators didn't glide, they stepped. We do not draw unbroken lines. We have never drawn unbroken lines. Our written language is built from individual pressed marks, not continuous stroke. It would not occur to a Threndal scholar in 1,000 years to ask whether something wants to be traced rather than read, because tracing is not a category of thought we have. Even our sight does not work the way yours does. We resolve motion in discrete intervals, frame to frame, the way your eyes resolve a held picture. A thing that moves continuously does not register to us as motion at all until it has already stopped. It was said without shame, a simple statement of architecture, the same way Wren might have said humans couldn't see in ultraviolet, but it landed on her like the missing piece of everything. That's why nobody's ever solved it, Wren said slowly. Not because it's too hard, because none of you can even ask the question. Every assay treated a moving thing like it was standing still, because standing still is the only way any of you have ever been able to look at anything. Show me, Sella said, which surprised them both, and pushed the notebook back across the table with a fresh page turned up. The star game. Show me what a human child can do that I cannot. Wren drew it in 4 seconds, a clean 5-pointed line that never lifted, and slid the pencil across to Sella's waiting claw. Sella tried. She tried 5 times, her forelimb moving in the same careful, discrete increments it used for every stamped Threndal glyph, and 5 times the line broke at the same point, a hesitation baked so deep into the muscle memory of an entire species that Sella herself looked faintly startled by it. Antennae drooping in an expression Wren was learning to read as something between embarrassment and genuine unease. I cannot make my hand not stop, Sella said, staring at the 5th broken attempt like it had personally betrayed her. I did not know that about myself until this exact moment. That's not a flaw, Wren said. It's just not the same shape of mind as whoever built that vault. You solve things by breaking them into parts nobody can argue with. I solve things by staring until the whole picture clicks. Neither one's better, but only one of them was ever going to see a walk instead of a text. Sella didn't answer that directly. She closed the notebook gently and pushed it back across the table. If you are right, she said, you have found something that 412 of my assembly's finest minds could not, using a children's game and 8 months in a supply closet. If you are wrong, you will have wasted the last week the cradle's rings will ever be capable of yielding anything at all, on a human girl's doodle, 3 days before the council forces Archscientist Van Tren to breach it by force instead. She hesitated, mandibles half open, and Wren caught something under the careful assembly diction, something closer to fear than skepticism. My cousin nymph molted gray last week. The wilt doesn't wait for us to be careful, Wren. Neither does the countdown. I will bring this to the Archscientist. I make no promise she will listen. Show me the unsigned one, Sella said. The maintenance note. You copied it into your book. I saw the page corner when you opened it earlier. You did not think I would notice, but I notice everything I am supposed to overlook. It is the one skill this assembly has never managed to train out of me. Wren found it and passed the notebook over, and Sella read the 600-year-old technician's account twice, mandibles motionless, before setting it down with unusual care. This was filed as noise. I filed things like this as noise myself, for 3 seasons, because that is what a junior adjutant is taught to call anything that cannot be replicated on demand. I did not ask myself, not once, why a species with our sight would build an instrument to spot patterns and then discard every pattern that only showed itself to an untrained body standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She looked up. You did not discard it. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just kept it, in case it mattered later. Wren shrugged, the specific, self-conscious shrug of someone who just realized a habit she'd never examined was actually a method. I do that with a lot of things, threads that don't fit the tidy version. My mom says I collect loose ends like other kids collect rocks. Sella closed the notebook gently, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into a register Wren hadn't heard from her before, quieter, less like an adjutant building an argument and more like a young woman admitting something she'd been carrying alone. My cousin nymph is called Prille. She is 8 seasons old, which your calendar would call something close to 6 of your years. I am not bringing this to the Archscientist only because the data is sound, Wren. I am bringing it because if there is even a chance that the reason none of us could solve this is written into how we are built, and not into how hard we have tried, then I owe it to Prille to find out before I run out of time to matter to her chances at all. But she didn't listen, not at first. Wren stood at the back of a briefing room 3 levels up 2 days later, allowed in only because Sella had insisted, against the visible discomfort of the 2 senior Assiers flanking the door, and watched Archscientist Ilyu Van Tren dismiss 5,000 years of assumption in under a minute. Van Tren's carapace had gone the deep matte gray of a Threndal in her final third of life, a color Wren had learned to read as asterisk senior the way she'd once read gray hair on a teacher, except that here it also meant something else. Van Tren had spent 40 of her own seasons on this exact vault, had personally overseen the 5th millennial assay's catastrophic countdown triggering failure 4 days ago, and had a council breathing over her carapace threatening to replace her with someone willing to authorize a full structural breach. Drills, charges, brute force that would very possibly destroy whatever the Kaladin had sealed inside along with the vault itself. She had trained under the last Archscientist to hold the post before her, had watched that woman retire quietly, unresolved, after 30 seasons of her own, and had promised herself, young and stubborn once in a way Wren suspected still lived somewhere under all that gray, that she would not leave the post the same way. A continuous stroke, Van Tren repeated, in the flat, over-articulated assembly standard she used for things she considered beneath argument. Adjutant Corps, I have read your report 3 times looking for the science in it and found a folk drawing game instead. Archscientist. The Marne null result stands on 11 years of processing across the finest reasoning engine this assembly has ever built. You are asking me to set that aside for a human child's notebook. Van Tren did not look at Wren when she said it, which was somehow worse than if she had. I have 4 days left before the council removes me from this vault and puts a demolition team in my place. I will not spend one of them indulging a theory built on paper. Then look at the overlay, Sella said, and there was steel in it that surprised even Wren. Not the theory, the data. 4 scans, 4 eras laid against the ring positions at time of capture. I checked the timestamps against the archive myself before I brought this to you. It is not a folk game, Archscientist. It is arithmetic. Van Tren looked at the overlay for 11 seconds, Wren counted, because counting was easier than breathing normally, and then set it down without a word and had Wren escorted out, and told Sella, in front of the whole room, that continuing to advocate for an unqualified minor's speculation would be noted in her scholar's file. Dale Kessler was called in that evening by the same floor manager who'd already flagged Wren once this cycle, a broad-shouldered Threndal named Adjunct Overseer Fenn Cal, who ran the understrata contract roster the way he ran everything, by the letter and without malice, which made the conversation worse, not better. Your daughter has now approached 3 separate members of the Science Assembly outside her assigned duties, Fenn Cal said, laying it out flat on the desk between them like a diagnostic report. The contract renewal board meets in 11 days. I am not required to include this incident in my recommendation. I am also not required to omit it. She's 15, Dale said. She's not trying to make trouble. I did not say she was. I said the board will not care about her intentions when it reads the incident log. Fenn Cal's antennae dipped, and if Wren's father hadn't spent 2 years learning to read the smallest Threndal tells, he might have missed that it wasn't hostility, exactly, just weary procedure. Keep her on assigned duties, Mr. Kessler. For both your sakes. Wren sat outside the office door with her notebook in her lap through the whole conversation, close enough to hear most of it through the thin partition, and understood, with a cold, clean feeling that had nothing to do with the station's recycled air, that she had just cost her father something and she didn't yet know how much. I'm sorry, she said when he came out. His face didn't have anger in it. That was almost worse. You didn't do anything wrong, he said, which she didn't entirely believe, and then, quieter, crouching down to her eye level the way he hadn't done since she was small. You really think you saw something they didn't? I know I did. He looked at her a long moment, the same look she realized later, that he must have given every impossible coolant line he'd ever fixed with parts that weren't rated for the job, the look of a man deciding whether a thing was actually broken or just unfamiliar. Contract renewal doesn't come up for 11 days, he said finally. That's not nothing, but it's not tomorrow either. Show me what you've got. All of it. If I'm going to risk it, I want to understand what I'm risking it on. That was the moment the grind of the week actually began, not in a briefing room, but in a supply closet with 2 flashlights, a spare hollow slate, and a father who trusted his daughter's eyes more than an assembly's 5,000 years of dogma, even as the ledger of what that trust might cost them both kept climbing in the background. They built the replica out of scraps, a decommissioned drone projector Dale had been meaning to report as unfit for use, cannibalized parts from a diagnostic kit he'd requisitioned under a work order that wasn't strictly this, and 3 straight nights of Wren mapping the composite line from her overlay sketches into a flat, scaled hollow plate she could actually touch. It took 41 hours to get the plate rendering the lattice at all. The first attempt produced only a smear of unreadable static, because she'd scaled the ring positions using station standard time increments instead of the cradle's own drift rate, an error that cost her a full night before she caught it comparing 2 archive timestamps against each other by hand. Another 19 hours passed before she trusted the scale enough to try tracing it, and somewhere in the middle of that stretch Dale fell asleep sitting up against a crate, still holding a flashlight steady on the projection, because she'd asked him to and he hadn't wanted to let her down by moving. Just past what the station clocks called ship's night on the 3rd day, a change in the corridor's ambient hum, the particular shift from full ventilation cycling to the quieter, single-fan drawl of a scheduled inspection sweep, pulled Dale upright off the crate so fast he nearly put his elbow through the projector housing. That's Wren Kessler's cadence, he said, low, already moving to kill the hollow plate's field before it had finished registering the command. 3rd shift maintenance super. He doesn't announce sweeps, he just walks them, and he walks this corridor every second night whether there's a work order flagged or not. He looked at Wren, and for the first time all week she saw real fear in his face that wasn't about the vault at all. If he finds an unregistered rig drawing power off a bent line, that's not a curiosity write-up, Wren. That's a theft of services flag, and those don't get quietly amended by a floor manager who likes you. That follows a contract family for years. They killed every light in the closet except the one dim service lamp clipped to the shelf, and Wren pressed herself into the gap behind the parts crate with the notebook flat against her chest, breathing shallow, while her father arranged himself in the doorway with a loose panel and a multi-tool in hand, the specific unbothered posture of a man doing exactly the job he was contracted to do and nothing else. She had seen him build that posture before, at dinner tables and shift change lines, the practiced calm of someone who'd spent 2 years learning exactly how much of himself a supervisor was allowed to see. The footsteps stopped outside the closet door for 11 seconds, she counted, because counting was still the only thing that kept her hands from shaking when there was nothing else to do with them. And then the door slid a third of the way open, throwing a wedge of corridor light across the floor and very nearly across the crate she was folded behind. Kessler. Wren's voice was flat, unhurried, a Threndal cadence Wren had learned to read as neither friendly nor hostile, just procedural, which after this week she'd come to understand was often more dangerous than either. Panel 306 is not on tonight's work order. Bracket's been loose since the coolant reroute Tuesday, Dale said, not looking up from the panel, his voice pitched into the same unbothered register as his posture. Figured I'd rather catch it on my own time than have it rattle loose during someone's shift and get written up for negligence I already knew about. You want it logged after the fact. I'll log it after the fact. A pause stretched long enough that Wren's pulse counted it out in her ears. Then, efficient of you. Nothing in the tone suggested HFY believed the explanation and nothing in it suggested he didn't. Threndal procedural courtesy, she was learning, ran exactly as deep as it needed to and no deeper. Keep the corridor clear of loose tools. Sweeps behind schedule as it is. The door slid shut. The footsteps resumed their unhurried cadence and faded back down the corridor, and it was a full 2 minutes before Dale let his shoulders drop from around his ears and reached over to bring the hollow plates field back online at a fraction of its previous brightness. "That's the closest anyone's come all week," he said, and there was a rasp in it that hadn't been there an hour ago. "I need you to understand something, Wren, and I need you to actually hear it instead of just nodding at me the way you do when you've already decided you're not going to change your mind. If this doesn't work, if the theory's wrong, or the timing's wrong, or the assembly just doesn't care what a scrap-built plate in a supply closet can do, I am not going to be able to protect you from what it costs. Not the renewal board. Not Cal. I've been bending things all week that I don't have the standing to bend, and I did it because I looked at what you had and I believed you. But believing you isn't the same as being able to fix it if I'm wrong too." Wren came out from behind the crate and sat down across from him on the cold floor, the notebook still held against her chest like something that might otherwise get away from her. "I know," she said. "I've known since the office with Cal. I just didn't say it back to you because I didn't want you to see me flinch from it. Grandma's paper thing, she says paper remembers what your hand was doing while you typed. I think that's true about people too. You don't get to pretend you didn't feel something just because you didn't say it out loud." She looked down at the plate, at the faint scattered noise still crawling across its edges, patient and unresolved. "I'm not doing this because I think I can't be wrong. I'm doing it because I looked at 412 attempts that all assumed the same thing, and none of them were wrong about the vault being hard. They were wrong about what kind of hard it was. I could still be one of the 413. But I don't think I am, and I've never been more sure of anything in my life, and I need you to let that be enough, even though I know it isn't actually enough. Not by the assembly's math or by yours." He didn't answer right away. He reached out instead and set his hand once flat against the top of the notebook, the same gesture her grandmother had used at a shuttle gate 3 years ago, pressing something breakable into small hands, and said, "Then we finish it tonight, both of us, all the way through, no more stopping at every noise in the corridor like it's the last one we'll ever hear." He picked the flashlight back up. "Show me segment 9 again. I want to understand the crossover math myself, not just watch you understand it." If I'm going to stand at that gallery rail in 2 days and not be able to do a single thing to help you once you're on the ladder, I want at least to know exactly what I'm watching." The first 11 attempts at the trace failed the way all first attempts fail. She lifted her stylus without meaning to, lost the thread at a junction where the line folded back so close to itself it looked, for a heartbeat, like it crossed. It didn't. That was the whole trick. The thing 412 assays had missed because none of them had ever needed to know it. The pattern was a single unicursal path, drawn to look like it might tangle and never actually did. A shape built by a species that apparently thought in continuous gestures the way Threndal thought in discrete, countable steps. On the 9th attempt she nearly gave up, sat back from the workbench with her eyes stinging from exhaustion, and it was Dale, half asleep and blunt about it, who said, "You said the whole point was not stopping. So don't stop," which was not scientific advice in any sense the assembly would have recognized, and turned out to be exactly what she needed to hear. On the 12th attempt, her stylus found the whole path in one motion, start to close, without lifting once. The hollow plate didn't explode with light or hum like a Juvet's half-legendary anecdote. It did something smaller and, to Wren, infinitely more convincing. It went quiet. The scattered, flickering noise pattern that had filled the projection's edges for 41 hours. Noise she'd assumed was just rendering error, smoothed into a single, steady, closed loop and held. She sat back from the workbench at 4 in the morning station time with her hands shaking and understood 2 things at once. She had just done, on a scrap-built replica, what the entire Threndal Science Assembly had failed to do in 5,000 years. And she had less than 3 days left before the real cradle either sealed itself forever or got drilled open by a demolition team that would not care what got destroyed in the process. She brought the working replica to Sella at first light. Sella brought it to Van Tren with her career on the line and didn't hesitate. This time, Van Tren watched the full demonstration in silence, her mandibles motionless in a way Wren was learning meant something closer to attention than dismissal. When it finished, the loop closing, the noise smoothing to quiet, holding, she didn't speak for a long moment. "Run it again," she said. Wren ran it again, and a third time with Assay Marshal Koth Draven now standing in the doorway, arms crossed in the rigid four-limbed stance Wren had learned meant deep institutional discomfort, and behind him 2 senior Assiers Wren recognized from the archive. One of them Atrin Vel, silent now, his earlier laughter nowhere in his posture. Draven had enforced the null-touch accord for 31 seasons, ever since the story of the 3 lost Assiers had been passed to him not as history, but as duty. His own teacher had been the one who pulled Threll Koss's original blood-sealed decree out of the archive vault, and made a young, furious Draven memorize it word for word after a junior colleague of his once suggested, half joking, that maybe someone should just try touching the thing. That colleague had been reassigned within the week. Draven had spent his entire career since making sure nobody ever tried that joke again. "A scrap-built projection proves nothing about the real vault," he said, when Van Tren finally looked to him. "The rings are not static art. They are load-bearing structure in active rotation, and this," he gestured, not unkindly at Wren, "is a human child proposing to walk across moving machinery that has killed people for standing near it, let alone touching it." "I'm not proposing to walk across it blind," Wren said, and her voice only shook a little. "I've watched every scan of the ring rotation timestamps for 8 months. I know their period. I know where they'll be, hour by hour, for the next 3 days better than the Cascade array does, because the array was never built to track motion, it was built to photograph frames. I can time it. You are 15 years old. I'm the only person on this station who's ever gotten it to answer twice." She heard how that sounded, too sharp, and didn't take it back. "Pelina Juvet got 1 hum in 800 years and you still teach her name like a saint's. I got a closed loop on the first working replica I built, and it held, and it's still holding right now on that plate behind you. I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm clever. I'm asking you to look at what's actually in front of you." Draven's antennae dropped slow, and for a moment nobody in the room said anything. It was Threndal, unexpectedly, who broke the silence, his voice smaller than Wren had ever heard it in the archive. "I dismissed her 3 days ago, Archscientist, in front of witnesses. I would like the record to show I was wrong, before someone forces a demolition team to prove it for me." "The council convenes in 2 days to authorize the breach team," Ventren said finally, to the room more than to any one person in it. "If they authorize it and it proceeds, there will be no further attempts of any kind, not mine, not the marshal's, not this child's. Whatever the Kaladin sealed in that cradle will either survive their drills or it will not, and either way the question that has outlived 5 wardens and 40 archscientists will simply stop being askable." She turned, finally, to look directly at Wren, and something in her matte gray face that had been closed for 40 seasons cracked open by exactly 1 degree. "I have spent my whole career believing that what we could not solve by rigor, we should not solve at all. Tell me why I should risk what remains of my authority in this assembly on a method my own biology cannot perform." "Because your biology isn't the one that has to perform it," Wren said. "Mine is." The council did not wait 2 days. Word of an unsanctioned, civilian claim against the cradle reached the senior chamber within hours, and the emergency session that followed was one Wren experienced secondhand. Crouched in the archive sub-basement beside a terminal Threndal had no business opening for her. "I should not be doing this," he said, already keying in a clearance code he technically wasn't supposed to still hold, patching the council's transcription feed through to the old speaker. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. It was Threndal's version of the correction he would formally enter into his own supervisory file 5 days later, not an apology spoken aloud, but an action taken at exactly the moment it would cost him something to take it. The feed crackled to life tinny and flat through the terminal's ancient speaker, and Wren sat on an overturned canister crate with her knees pulled up, and listened to 5 of the most powerful individuals in the Threndal Science Assembly begin arguing over whether she deserved 31 hours, making herself keep breathing evenly through all of it, because Sella's hand had found her shoulder somewhere in the first 2 minutes and hadn't left since, and she didn't want to be the reason it started shaking. Councillor Urbraca chaired it, the same overmodulated voice from the public feed on the day of the failed assay, flanked by 4 other council seats, and, for the first time in the Assembly's history, an open channel to the Wilt Containment Office, whose representative spoke for less than a minute and left the whole chamber quieter than it had been in years. Nymph mortality in the current outbreak cluster had crossed a threshold the office's models had not expected to reach for another 2 months. Whatever the cradle held, the office wanted it soon, by whatever method got there fastest. "The Archscientist proposes delaying the breach authorization by 3 days, Urbraca said, on the strength of a demonstration performed by an unlicensed juvenile, on hardware built from salvaged station parts, in a supply closet. I decline to believe a human child's hobby will succeed where 40 Archscientists failed, and I will not be remembered as the counselor who let sentiment cost us 6 months of breach preparation already staged and paid for." Ventren answered that one herself, and it was the part of the recitation Sella delivered slowest, as though she wanted Wren to hear every word exactly as it had been said. 40 Archscientists failed because 40 Archscientists approached a moving thing as though it were standing still, Ventren told the chamber. "I have spent my own career among that number. I do not say this lightly, and I do not say it because I have grown fond of a human runner. I say it because I watched her replica hold a closed loop 3 times in front of witnesses, and I have not once, in 40 seasons, watched anything about that vault hold at all." A newer voice entered the argument next. One Sella's recitation lingered on longer than any other because, she admitted to Wren afterward, It was the only part of the whole session that had nearly undone her own composure. Counselor Isvaring, the newest and by every account least senior seat on the chamber, barely 2 seasons into her post, spoke for the first time in the entire session, her voice tighter than the practice council register, something raw showing through the procedural varnish. I have sat in this chamber for 2 seasons and said very little, because I am aware of exactly how little standing a new seat carries against 40 collective seasons of caution, Varing said. I will say something now. My own nymph molted his second gray patch 11 days ago. The Wilt Office's representative has told this chamber, in this very session, that the outbreak has already outpaced its models. I do not care whether the method that opened that vault fits into a category this assembly has a name for. I care whether it worked, and Assay Marshal Draven has told us, under oath to his own 31 seasons of service, that it did. I move we grant the Archscientist her window. Sella told Wren afterward that the chamber had gone very still after that, the particular stillness of a room full of the powerful realizing that the newest and least protected member among them had just risked more, in one unscripted sentence, than most of them had risked in whole careers, and that no amount of procedural polish from anyone else in the room was going to be able to talk the moment back down to where it had been before she'd spoken. Van Tren fought for the full 3 days and did not get them. What she got, after nearly 2 hours of argument that cost her, by Sella's count, most of the political capital she had left in the assembly, was 31 hours, a single narrow window before the breach team's drills were cleared to begin. The margin turned, in the end, on the last person in the chamber anyone expected to speak in Wren's favor. Assay Marshal Koth Draven rose from a seat he hadn't been required to attend and addressed the council in the same flat, procedural cadence he used for citing regulation. I have enforced the null-touch accord for 31 seasons, he said, on the belief that it existed only to keep Assiers alive. I have personally witnessed a working replica hold a closed loop 3 times this week, a result no remote method has produced in 5,000 years of trying. If I am wrong about what the accord was protecting us from, I would rather be the one who found that out than the one who let a demolition team find out for me, in a manner from which there is no correcting the record afterward. The chamber, Sella said, had gone very quiet at that, in the particular way rooms full of the powerful go quiet when someone with nothing personally to gain has just told them something true. It cost Van Tren nearly everything she had left. A formal reprimand entered against her name before the session even closed, a demolition team pre-staged and waiting at the pit's edge with 31 hours on their own separate clock, and a security override, signed personally and irreversibly, that let 3 unauthorized humans stand on a restricted platform above 5,000 years of dead civilization's last secret, with less than a day and a half remaining. Wren stood at the access hatch in a borrowed environment suit 2 sizes too big, her notebook, the actual paper one, because she trusted her own hand over any slate when it mattered, strapped flat against her forearm, and looked down into the pit at the cradle's 3 rings. Motionless now in the frozen configuration, the failed assay had locked them into 6 days before. They weren't motionless. She'd been wrong about that from the observation gallery, and it had taken 41 hours of replica work to understand why. The rings didn't rotate in the smooth, continuous sweep the old scans implied. They crept in small, discrete increments, exactly the way a Threndal hand moved. The Kaladin had built the cradle's outer mechanism to match the cognition of whoever might one day come looking for it, and every civilization that had ever approached it had assumed the increments were the whole of the motion, instead of just its skeleton, a scaffold meant to be filled in by something willing to move continuously across the gaps. That was the last piece, not a mechanism she had to defeat, a structure built for exactly one kind of hand, waiting 5,000 years for it to show up. The path crosses all 3 rings, she said aloud, partly for Draven's benefit, standing rigid at the console behind her with his claw hovering over an emergency recall switch he'd sworn to use the instant anything looked wrong. Inner ring first, 11 segments, then the crossover to the middle band while it's still in its close interval window. That's the part that killed the Assiers. They touched down on the crossover a half-second after the window closed and the band sheared. I've timed it against 6 days of increment logs. I have 4 seconds on the crossover, not more. And if you are wrong by half of 1 second, Draven said, you will lose exactly what Threll Kass's Assiers lost. I know, her voice didn't shake this time. I'm not wrong. Van Tren, watching from the gallery rail with the whole weight of a career she was very possibly about to lose settled across her gray shoulders, said nothing at all. She had run out of doctrine to offer and had not yet decided what to put in its place. Beside her, Sella stood with all 4 limbs locked rigid, and further back, kept there only by his own promise not to interfere unless the recall switch was called. Dale Kessler watched his daughter climb down into a pit that had killed people, and said nothing either, because there was nothing left to say that would not cost her the concentration she needed more than his fear right now. Wren went down the access ladder into the pit alone, because the increments were narrow enough for one small body and not for a Threndal's 4-limbed frame, and because, though nobody said this part aloud, it had to be a hand shaped like hers, or it would prove nothing to anyone. The inner ring's surface was warmer than she expected, faintly textured under her glove. The golden lattice lines dark and dormant where 6 days ago they'd flared white. She found the first segment exactly where her increment logs put it, and set her palm flat against the vault's face for the first time in 5,000 years that any living hand had dared to. Nothing happened. No alarm, no recoil. Just cold black alloy, and beneath it, the faintest structural hum she felt more in her sternum than her ears. She began to move. 11 segments across the inner ring, and she paced them the way she'd paced the star game 1,000 times as a kid at a kitchen table, not fast, not careful in the stiff, hesitant way an unfamiliar task demanded, but fluid, trusting the motion once it started. Because the whole insight had been that stopping to check was the mistake, that the shape only worked as long as you committed to it. Her boots found each foothold as the increments crept open beneath her, her free hand tracing the lattice groove with 2 fingers exactly where the composite overlay said the line continued. And on the 8th segment her foot came down a fraction early, the increment not yet fully open beneath her. And for one heartbeat the whole plan hung on whether she'd throw herself backward or forward. She threw herself forward, trusting the line more than her own instinct to retreat, and the increment finished opening a half-breath later, her boot landing clean where it needed to. The near miss cost her nothing in distance but something more expensive in composure, a full breath's worth of the steadiness she'd need for the crossover still to come, and she spent 3 strides getting it back the only way she knew how. Counting, the same trick that had gotten her through the lift shaft 6 days ago, through the mess hall silence, through every hour since the rings first screamed. 11 segments, 8 behind her, 3 ahead, and then a gap no wider than a doorway that would either take 4 seconds of her life and give the vault back, or take considerably more than 4 seconds and give nothing back at all. She did not let herself finish that second half of the thought. She had promised herself, in the supply closet on the 12th attempt, that stopping to weigh the cost was the one move the pattern never forgave, and she intended to keep that promise all the way to the last segment or not at all. Somewhere above her, she heard Draven's voice crack out a warning she didn't have time to process. She didn't stop. The crossover came faster than she'd rehearsed it in her head. The middle band's close interval window was a gap no wider than a doorway, closing in real time, the 2 rings' edges grinding toward each other with a low, grating groan that she felt in her teeth. She had 4 seconds. She used one deciding not to freeze, and that left 3. She jumped. Her boots hit the middle ring's surface a half-second inside the window, momentum carrying her forward into a roll that scraped her shoulder hard against the alloy, and behind her the gap she'd crossed sheared shut with a sound like a mountain closing its mouth. She didn't stop to feel the fear that tried to catch up with her. She'd known, going in, that stopping was the one true failure state. She got up, found the line again with her fingers, and kept moving. Her shoulder screamed where the alloy had scraped it in the roll. A hot line of pain she filed away with the same ruthless efficiency she'd learned filing away everything else this week that wasn't the vault. Because there would be time to feel it later, on the gallery, with her father's arm around her. And there was no time to feel it now. Her suit's forearm display flickered once, the increment log stuttering as a hairline crack she hadn't noticed in the housing let a thread of static creep into the readout. And for 3 full segments, she lost the numbers that had been the whole architecture of her plan. No countdown. No confirmation of where the ring's next opening would fall. Nothing but her own memory of 6 days of logs, and the groove under her fingers telling her where the line wanted to go next. She thought, for one white, airless second, that this was exactly the kind of gap that had taken Threll Kass's Asir her hand 5,000 years ago. A plan built on data, and the data failing at the only moment it couldn't afford to. Then she thought of her grandmother's kitchen table, the pencil that never lifted, 9 wrong tries before her hand, finally understood what her eyes already knew, and understood with a clean and steadying certainty that had nothing to do with instruments at all, that she had not actually been following the increment log this whole time. She had been following it the way a new driver follows a map before the roads become familiar enough to drive by feel useful. And then, at exactly the moment it failed her, no longer necessary, because her hand already knew the shape from 400 repetitions on paper and 41 hours on the replica, knew it the way it knew the star game, the way it knew Milo's seam. She stopped checking the display. She let her fingers lead instead, tracing the groove at the pace her whole body had rehearsed without her mind's help. And 2 segments later the display resolved itself, the static clearing as suddenly as it had come, numbers scrolling back into alignment with exactly where her hand had already decided to be. She would learn later, from the engineers who examined the suit afterward, that the crack had very nearly cost her the whole log permanently. A single loose contact, one hard jolt from failing outright. She would also learn, turning it over privately in the weeks after, that the 3 segments she'd crossed blind were the 3 she remembered most clearly of the whole climb, not because they were the most dangerous, but because they were the only ones where she had trusted the shape completely, with nothing left to check it against. The middle ring segments ran tighter together than the inner rings had, and twice she felt her balance go, catching herself with her free hand flat against alloy that hummed faintly warmer now than it had at the start, as though the vault itself were waking by degrees, tracking her progress the way it must once have tracked whatever hand the Kaladin had originally built it for. She did not look up at the gallery. She did not let herself wonder what her father's face looked like right now. She counted segments instead, the way she'd counted them 100 times against the increment logs in the supply closet, and when the middle ring's final segment gave way beneath her boot, she was already reaching for the outer ring's first foothold before her balance had fully settled. A voice cut across the gallery comm behind her, not Draven, not Van Tren, but the breach team's staged foreman, watching the whole attempt on a secondary feed and demanding loudly that someone invoke emergency recall before the girl became a second null-touch casualty on his watch. Wren heard Van Tren's answer without turning, sharp enough to carry down into the pit. "The recall is mine to call, and I have not called it. Stand down." She didn't know, in that moment, what it cost the Archscientist to say it, only that the voice didn't waver, and that was enough to let her keep moving instead of flinching. The outer ring was slower, wider spaced, forgiving in a way the crossover hadn't been, and by the time she reached its final segment her lungs were burning and her notebook page, glimpsed once fast to confirm the last turn of the path, was smudged with the sweat off her glove. Twice in the outer ring's last stretch her boot found less purchase than the increment log promised, the ring's motion running a fraction ahead of what 6 days of logged behavior should have allowed, as though the vault itself had begun, by degrees, to anticipate her rather than simply tolerate her. A Juvet's note come back to her in a rush, unbidden. It is trying to finish a sentence I keep interrupting, and Wren understood. Crossing the last open gap with her arms windmilling for balance she didn't quite have, that the vault wasn't testing her anymore. It was matching her pace, the way a dance partner matches a lead they've only just learned to trust, and the realization steadied her more than any handhold could have. She traced the final stretch of unbroken line with her whole palm flat against the surface, closing the loop exactly where it had started, on the inner ring, 5,000 years and 11 seconds after Threndal Science had sealed this place, believing no hand should ever finish what the Kaladin had started. The lattice didn't flare white this time. It went gold, all at once, every line she'd traced and every line she hadn't lighting in sequence like a held breath finally released, and the low structural hum she'd felt in her sternum since the first touch swelled into something that was almost music, Pelina Juvet's half-legendary hum. Wren realized dimly, not a fluke after all, but the same vault trying, 800 years ago, to answer a question that had only ever been asked halfway. The 3 rings began to turn, smooth and continuous now, no longer creeping in discrete Threndal increments, but flowing the way the line itself had always wanted to move. And at the cradle's dormant center, a seam that had not existed a minute earlier split open along a curve exactly matching the shape in Wren's notebook. Nobody in the gallery made a sound. Draven's claw had come off the recall switch at some point without him seeming to notice. What the Kaladin had sealed inside, 5,000 years before any Threndal ship had found their ruins, was not a weapon and not a treasure in the way the Council's most anxious projections had guessed. It was a library, small and dense and cold, row on row of storage lattices holding. The analysis would take the Assembly's best minds another 6 months to fully translate, but the first fragments came back within days, a genetic archive of a civilization that had faced, and survived, its own version of the gray wilt 3,000 years before it ever touched a single Threndal nymph. The Kaladin hadn't hidden a message. They'd left a door, built to open only for whoever proved they could see a shape too whole to be read in pieces, because a species capable of that kind of seeing was, in the Kaladin's own dead judgment, the kind worth trusting with what came after. Ventren found Wren on the gallery 2 hours later, still in the too big suit, sitting with her father's arm around her shoulders, and her notebook, scorched at one corner where it had brushed a live conduit during the crossover jump, held flat against her knees. The Archscientist's carapace had not changed color. Gray was gray, the mark of 40 seasons that didn't reverse because a 5,000-year mystery had finally cracked. But something in the set of her mandibles had, and when she spoke, it was without the flat over-articulation she used for things beneath argument. "I have spent my career," she said, "believing that rigor was the only honest path to understanding, and that anything reached by another road was luck dressed up as insight. I owe you a correction to that belief, and I do not know yet how to phrase it in assembly standard, because we do not have a formal category for a species that thinks the way you evidently do." She paused, and Wren, exhausted past the point of nerves, simply waited. "The Council will want your name on the record. I intend to insist on it being your own, and not a footnote to mine." "I don't need a footnote," Wren said. "I need to know if it helps the nymphs. The genomic archive is being cross-referenced against wilt pathology as we speak. Early modeling is," Ventren stopped, chose the word with visible care, "hopeful. Adjutant Corps' cousin among the first the medical division intends to treat, should the modeling hold." Dale Kessler's hand tightened once on his daughter's shoulder, and he didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying that the two of them hadn't already said to each other in a supply closet 3 nights before, over a scrap-built hollow plate and a girl's stubborn certainty that nobody had bothered to actually look. Behind Van Tren, Assay Marshal Draven stood a careful distance back, and when Wren finally looked at him, he inclined his head, once, in a gesture she hadn't seen him use before and would later learn was reserved, in Threndal custom, for a debt formally acknowledged rather than merely felt. 31 seasons I told every Asir under me that the accord existed to keep people alive, he said, when she caught his eye. I did not consider, until 3 days ago, that it might also have been keeping the answer out. Sella came up the ladder a few minutes later, moving in the quick, unsteady gait of someone who'd been running, and stopped in front of Wren with all 4 limbs briefly, uncharacteristically still. "You closed the loop," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I closed the loop," Wren agreed, and found, digging for it, that she had exactly enough voice left for a small, tired laugh. "Turns out it just wanted somebody who wasn't afraid to lift their hand off the page at the wrong moment. You all kept trying to read it. It wasn't a book. It was a walk." 6 days later, on the station's public feed, the Assembly issued its formal record of the 5th millennial assay's true result. Not a failure, as every assay before it had been logged, but the first assay in 5,000 years to succeed, credited by name to Wren Kessler, human, age 15, contract dependent. For reasoning the Threndal Science Assembly's own greatest minds had spent 5 millennia unable to reach, because the answer had never lived in more rigor. It had lived in a different way of holding the pencil. The medical division's first confirmed wilt reversal came 4 days after that. In a nymph ward Wren was allowed to visit once, briefly, at Sella's insistence. Sella's cousin, small and quiet and still mottled gray along one flank in a way the doctors said would take another season to fully clear, but breathing easy, molting on schedule for the first time since the diagnosis. Sella didn't say anything when Wren stood at the incubator rail. She just reached over with one claw-tipped limb and rested it lightly against Wren's shoulder, the closest thing to the human gesture Wren had ever seen a Threndal attempt on purpose. The Assembly held a small formal recognition in the observation gallery a week later, nothing like the ceremony that had been planned for the 5th millennial itself. No info drones, no council dais, just Van Tren, Draven, Sella, a handful of senior Asirs who had spent 5,000 collective years of institutional memory being wrong about the same vault, and Dale Kessler standing at the back in his cleanest work vest, arms crossed, refusing to let anyone see how close he was to losing his composure. Van Tren read the amended assay record aloud in full Assembly standard, every syllable deliberate, and when she reached Wren's name she did not shorten it, did not translate it into a Threndal honorific, read it exactly as Wren had given it to her the first day they'd met in a briefing room that hadn't wanted her there. Fen Cal, invited as a formality nobody expected him to accept, stood near the door for the whole thing and afterward told Dale, without much ceremony of his own, that the incident log from 3 weeks ago had been quietly amended to a commendation instead, and that the contract renewal board would be hearing about it from him personally. Wren read the formal record once herself, standing at the observation rail where she'd first watched the ring scream, and then she closed her notebook, tucked it under her arm, and went to find her father, because her mother's comm window opened in 20 minutes and she had, for once in her life, an easy answer ready for the question every message from 3 systems away eventually asked. "How was your week?" "Good," she'd tell her. "Long, but good." She'd solved something nobody else could see, not because she was smarter than 5,000 years of trying, but because she'd never stopped believing a line could go somewhere, as long as you didn't lift your hand until it got there. She'd tell her mother about the notebook, and the crossover jump, and Sella's cousin breathing easy in the ward, and she'd leave out exactly how close the timing had been on segment 8, because some things a daughter let a mother believe had gone more smoothly than they had, the same way Milo let her believe she couldn't find the seam in his drawings. She still could, she just never told him where. The formal record closed one chapter of the week. It took the better part of 2 months for the rest of it to finish arriving, in the slow, uneven way large consequences always did on a station that measured its own history in shift rotations rather than headlines. The genomic archives cross-reference against wilt pathology confirmed what the medical division's cautious early modeling had only dared to hope. A viable treatment pathway, not a cure exactly, but a reversal protocol effective in case after case where nothing in 5,000 years of Threndal medicine had managed more than slowing the modeling down. Sella's cousin Prille was the third confirmed reversal, then the 30th, then a number large enough that the Wilt Containment Office stopped issuing individual case updates and started issuing curves instead, the kind of chart a species allowed itself to hope in front of once the early data held past the point where hope usually broke. Her grandmother's reply letter arrived by the slow route 6 weeks after the formal record closed, paper and ink, the actual physical kind that took a cargo run and a custom stamp, and 3 separate hands to reach a station 4 systems from Earth, because her grandmother had never once, in 3 years of Wren's absence, sent anything important by comm when paper would eventually get there instead. It was 4 pages long, longer than any letter she'd sent before, and most of it was the ordinary news of a retired transit engineer's ordinary life. A switch she'd fixed for a neighbor, a garden bed that hadn't survived the spring frost, a complaint about a delivery drone that kept clipping her fence post. The last paragraph was not ordinary at all. I taught you a doodle at a kitchen table, because it was the only thing I had to give a girl I already knew was going to be asked to leave more of her childhood behind than any of us wanted for her. Her grandmother had written, in handwriting that had gotten smaller and more careful with age rather than looser, the opposite of what Wren would have guessed. I did not teach it to you because I thought it would matter. I taught it to you because it was mine to give, and because your hands needed something to do while the rest of you figured out how to be brave. It turns out I gave you a key and called it a game and didn't know it either. Paper remembers, sweetheart. I told you that at the gate and I'll tell you again now. So do I. I am very proud of you, and I am, for the first time in longer than I will admit to your father, glad I am too old and too stubborn to have gone with all of you when the family split apart, because someone needed to stay on Earth and keep teaching this to the next kid who needed it. And I did not know until this month that the next kid would turn out to be you. Wren read it 3 times before she let herself cry over it, alone in her bunk with the notebook, repaired now, the scorched corner sanded smooth by a station conservator who'd asked, with unusual gentleness for a Threndal handling human contraband, whether she wanted the burn mark kept visible as part of the record or restored to look the way it had before. She'd asked him to keep it. Some things, she decided, a story was allowed to show its scars. Milo's reaction, when the story finally reached the general news feeds on Earth 8 weeks after the closed loop, 3 light-lag days after Wren had already told him herself in a call she'd made a point of getting to him before any stranger's version could, was not the reaction she'd braced for. She'd expected pride and got it. She'd expected fear, delayed and retroactive, at exactly how close segment 8 had come, and got that too, in a short furious lecture about hiding things from him that he delivered with his arms crossed in an uncanny echo of their father's own posture. What she hadn't expected was the drawing that arrived in his next data packet 3 days later. Not a star, not a spiral, but the cradle itself, 3 concentric rings rendered in a 10-year-old's careful crayon, 1 continuous unbroken line looping through all 3 without a single visible seam, and a note in his careful, backward-leaning print underneath it. Drew it without lifting the crayon. Betcha still can't tell where I started. She could tell, this time, there was the faintest hitch near the outer ring, a half-heartbeat's hesitation before he'd committed to the last stretch, the same tell his hand always gave, the same tell hers probably still gave somewhere too fine for even her own eye to catch. She didn't tell him that either. Some habits were worth keeping exactly as long as the people they protected needed them kept. Wren stayed on Vantage another 2 years after that, finished growing up in the shadow of a vault that no longer had anything left to hide, and kept the notebook, new pages added steadily, old ones never removed, close enough at hand that when her mother's contract finally ended, and the whole scattered Kessler family found itself, improbably, in the same system for the first time in 5 years, she brought it with her to the reunion still half full of blank paper. Because her grandmother had been right about paper remembering, and there was, she decided a long time ago, in a supply closet with a scrap-built hollow plate, and a father who believed her before he had any proof to believe her with, always going to be more of the line left to draw.